welcome to the Theology Pugcast. It's great to have you here for this episode. And I am C.R. Wiley. I'm a pastor serving a church in the Pacific Northwest. I'm a senior editor at Touchstone Magazine. But today, I'm here in Connecticut at my Connecticut house, and it's a nice sunny day. The first day, is this the first day of spring? I think it is. Anyway, spring is close if this isn't the first day, but I believe it is the first day. Anyway, enough of that light, fluffy, meaningless kind of ramble. Glenn, do you want to tell us a little bit about yourself?
Yeah, I'm Glenn Sunshine. I am a senior fellow at the Colson Center for Christian Worldview, a ministry associate at Reflections Ministries, and I have my own ministry called Every Square Inch Ministries. I write, I teach, I speak, I do a bunch of things that involve words.
That's right. Words are helpful. Words are helpful. We use them every day. Okay, Tom, why don't you introduce yourself? And then before we jump into the topic of the day, and it's your day, I have something I want to say about our trip to the UK.
Okay. I'm Tom Price. I write and teach and speak and do all those things as well. One of the places is Gordon Conwell Theological Seminary, where I teach systematic theology and Christian ethics.
Well, the news, of course, isn't news. We are going to the United Kingdom, and we're going to be there in late May. But you can help us out. We have an Indigo Go Campaign, and we've raised almost $800 through it so far, but we'd like to do a lot better than that. We're looking to raise funds to underwrite some of the production costs that will incur in the creation of the shows while we're there, but also a little documentary that we're hoping to make. And there's a link in the show notes. We have a lot of folks who support us on a regular basis through Patreon, and we really appreciate that. But this is kind of a special event and kind of something that requires above and beyond support to make work. We're glad that all of our expenses are taken care of in the sense that the flights, our lodging, our transportation while we're there, what we're going to eat, all that kind of stuff, we don't need to worry about that. But we do have some unmet costs when it comes to the actual production of the content that we hope to create while we're there. So if you have an interest in supporting us out on this Oxford experience and this Inkling kind of themed tour of Oxford, please click the link in the show notes to the Indigo Go Campaign and help us out. Anyway, enough of that. Tom, tell us about what we're talking about today.
Okay, and before I do, I just thought of something related to that. Maybe we have listeners that are in Oxford. Wouldn't be so uncommon. I still have some good friends there, but maybe it's worth them reaching out. So should they feel the inclination, reach out. It would be good to connect or at least make your acquaintance.
Yeah. And related to that, we're going to have some shows that it'd be fun to have some people kind of sitting around us, kind of eavesdropping in on. So maybe we can even have folks connect with us that way too.
Absolutely. So the topic of the day, maybe the way to put it up front and see if we end up with the same topic by the end of the show is immodesty and the image of God.
Oh, wow. That's a great one.
Immodesty, right?
Yeah.
And the image of God. Now, I'm going to start with immodesty, and maybe we can pull towards the image of God by the end of the show. One of the things I notice, and this is nothing new for anyone who's grown up in our culture, is, this continuous flirtation with immodesty. It's kind of what, when Lewis talks about in Mere Christianity, the different ways in which immodesty can show up. There is one kind that is kind of uncharitable, where it's always trying to push the boundary. It's always trying to offend kind of sensibilities. And we notice this especially as shock value is becoming harder and harder to be achieved in order to get attention when you don't have much talent otherwise, right? I mean, what is one of the ways in which all these entertainers tend to stay in the news, but the shock value of their relationships or something they do, a public stunt?
Yeah. You think about a lot of pop music people. that don't strike me as terribly impressive in terms of talent, but they certainly have an ability to keep themselves in the public eye through spectacle.
Yes. Yes, and it's that sort of, it is usually driven, well, not usually, but a lot of the time you're right. There's a missing element in terms of talent or ability, or one that just doesn't sustain the kind of attention you feel like you need, that you have to continuously, push this boundary and see that as quote unquote art, or see it as part of you as an artist. I mean, there's a long history. I'm sure Glenn could jump in with a lot of the whole history that, out of the Romantic period that kind of has kind of lent itself to that. And it might be worth exploring. But one of the things I noticed, I don't pay a lot of attention to kind of the common cultural occurrences like, the Oscars or, these different events, but they get shoved in my face one way or the other, whether it's through trying to catch up with the news or reading, listening to some other shows' analysis. But one of the things I heard recently at this most recent Oscars, what apparently there were a few different quote unquote shocking moments, right? Of course, this is to get people to watch a show that's increasingly boring to watch. But one of them was sort of this male that comes out all buff, but basically in the buff, leaving little to the imagination. And then, of course, there was this endless focus on the ladies' evening wear that were basically see-through and nothing to hide. And the first, my first kind of gut reaction is, okay, more attention seeking. And then I thought kind of, you have this episode where they just got nothing left to do to really capture the attention. So what is it in a culture that's still captured by that kind of action? I mean, it sort of reminds me of C.S. Lewis, where he's talking about what if you had a culture that had an unhealthy kind of appetite for food? And what if you noticed that people were continuously going to these shows where they're lifting the lid over and they're revealing a little bit of a steak? It's kind of like the metaphor for kind of the sex appetite gone the wrong way. And we sort of are in a culture like that. But I've noticed, one of the things that attention-grabbing type entertainment is driven by, of course, is attention grabbing, right? It's one of the ways they stay in the spotlight. And so when you hear things like, wardrobe malfunction, right? You hear it at every event now. We know what that means. It was set up to malfunction. So it didn't look like it was offending or done in bad manners. It was an accident, right? But it still got the effect. But one of the things, I was thinking about is that what you have happen, especially with the whole kind of flooding of the social atmosphere, at least in the U.S. especially, with the woke scene and, of course, the trans agenda, is that those have become kind of the symbolic central figures. And so, for example, the kind of trans personality that is kind of the man who, finds himself, expressing himself as a woman, has kind of replaced the focus on men and women. And it is almost as if certain characters, to get attention, are coming out with their body buff and naked to almost reassert attention on something which is getting ignored and no attention otherwise, because it isn't part of the fashion of the moment. And so you almost start to see how far does the competition go to who gets symbolic representation and attention in a culture. Yeah, I'm not saying that's the only thing driving it.
No, I think this is great, Tom, because you're moving this in a direction that maybe the term immodesty wouldn't tend to move. I mean, I think, at the core of immodesty is this quest for fame or to be the object of adoration or at least curiosity. It reminds me of a book that I studied when I was at Harvard. I was introduced to entitled "The Frenzy of Renown" by Leo Braudy. I don't know if you've ever heard of it. It was a really marvelous treatment of the role of sort of renown or fame in the history of the West. It starts with Homer and comes into the present, and it's all about this attention-seeking appetite, and the term frenzy is a good one, because what we're talking about here, and so this gets at something that maybe is part of the picture that just isn't given much attention, and that is maybe this isn't about or exclusively about being a woman in a man's body. Maybe this is about just I want to be the center of attention. And this seems to be working.
Well, that's right. It works until it doesn't work, right? Glenn, you were going to say something.
Yeah, there's another dimension to this. If you take a look at the idea of expressive individualism that Carl Trueman talks about, one of the rules in expressive individualism is you can't accept any outside definitions of who you are. Family, tradition, culture, and these days biology you cannot accept those constraints. And so to live your authentic life, you have to reject all of those things and just look inside. And thus, and then this connects in with at least some branches of the Romantic movement, particularly some of the British Romantics. It needs to be transgressive. Mm-hmm. And so when you add those sort of things into the cultural mood, we're at a point where being transgressive is really the name of the game on pretty much every level.
Yeah. Yeah, I'm going to be returning to this point with full coverage if I can in a little bit. But one of the things that's great about
nice choice of words there, Tom.
But one of the things I want to catch on to is that defines a certain conception in the contemporary world of what it means to be a self, right? To be an authentic self, to be free, to be what you are or who you are. That is a core definition, or one of the core definitions that floats around. Now, there are some others around, but that is one of them. And one of the things I want to get to with that is how that itself is something that's fundamentally undermining of what it means to be made as an image bearer. And I will get there, but that's just something to hold on to as I move into the next steps. So one of the second culture. Go ahead.
Yeah. I'm sorry to interrupt here, Tom, but this was prompting something, that I just can't help but share, and that's I'm currently reading Athanasius's Life of Anthony. So this, of course, is a marvelous biopic, and it's not very long. And by Athanasius, this isn't like an biographical work. It's not like Anthony talking about himself. But Athanasius knew Anthony, and he is writing about somebody who was trying to stay out of the limelight, which is this another. You think about this, and the harder he tried to get away from the crowds, the more.
More it comes.
Yeah. There's this point where he's like, I can't get alone. So he gets some Saracens, believe it or not, who lead him out into the desert, and he finds this mountain, like 2 or 3 days journey out into the desert. He's like, at last. It's got a few date palms, it's got a nice spring, and he says, at last I can be alone. And the next thing you know, the crowds are coming.
It's sort of like Frodo telling Sam, I'm going to Mordor alone. And Sam says, of course you are, and I'm coming with you.
That's right. But this also brings up this marvelous phenomenon in Mark's gospel, the Messianic secret, where Jesus keeps telling people, don't tell anybody, and the crowds keep getting bigger and bigger.
Well, and again, we're going to see a little bit later, even when Rousseau comes out and basically argues that he doesn't want to be mimicked or copied, he's a genuine article. I mean, it's the whole point is all you've done is now created everyone trying to be genuine articles, right?
Well, going back a few decades, I remember the Madonna wannabes, who, when you ask, why are you imitating Madonna, it's so that I can express myself.
Yeah, but Glenn, you've almost taken my show away from. Okay, so hold on to that one too. Okay, so I have one last point before we start moving into the imitative, because the imitative is going to be key, and the fact that we can't not imitate. Yeah. So, but one of the other thing I noticed, that another trend I saw, was this young girl. What is her name? Last name is Riley. She is a Christian who was kind of frustrated because she kept losing to a trans.
No, her first name is Riley. Riley Gaines.
Riley. Okay, Riley Gaines. And apparently she's done some things that a lot of kind of hyper, retaliatory Christians have jumped on. She gave some speech on sort of sexual integrity, and she had a little bit of her stomach showing. And of course, she and some other females have recently, from what I hear, done a bathing suit calendar, right? And so some Christians have come up and said, this isn't Christian modesty. And again, it would be good to read Lewis for a lot of these people on the question of different generations of modesty, and how that doesn't mean you're undermining chastity just because of that. But that's not really the point. The point is, again, when the erasure of the female is taking place, you're seeing a reaction develop to where that does not happen, that there is an emphasis on what it means to be a genuine article versus the other. And this may look like an immodesty situation when it's actually trying to affirm something fundamental about the differences between male and female, and what embodying a real femininity means versus not. It may not be good taste, okay? That can be debated. But what you see is people from a different generation reacting to their erasure.
Yeah, there are lots of sort of conflicting, I guess, trends here. Yeah. One of the things you're getting at, Tom, is the nature of female immodesty. So there's male immodesty, there's female immodesty, and when we think about immodesty, we usually think in terms of just sort of displaying the flesh.
Yeah.
Sort of provocative, sexualized, sensual content. But one of the things that I've thought about as a man, trying to get my head, or sort of get an understanding of what motivates young women to do this, because it's not as though these are all girls. I'm talking about the ones who actually do this. We're constantly bombarded as heterosexual men in social media with salacious content. It doesn't matter, it doesn't matter. You could be the most withdrawn and asexual man alive. You're going to be bombarded with stuff on the internet. And I don't know if many women have an appreciation for this, because I imagine that much of the stuff that we see, they don't see. But what we get is just a lot of young women putting their bodies on display before us. And it doesn't matter how many times you shut it off or complain to Facebook or to Instagram, it doesn't keep it from happening. That's right. I think the reason it doesn't keep it from happening is because it's a moneymaker for those institutions.
Sure.
But you also wonder, what's in it for the gals? Yeah. There's the explanation. Well, yeah, there's some pimp behind the scenes, and sometimes, but I think often, very, very often, it's something else entirely. It's not as though these girls are looking for sexual engagement. What they're looking for is fame and attention. Yeah. And this is the means to get it. And it's also kind of a power trip. There's a dynamic in terms of, okay, I've got to hook into this guy. And that's kind of a turn on in a different way, if you get my drift. Yeah. I'm not talking about sexual turn on, but it's just a sense that, wow, this is great. I've got 1 million views because I showed a little cleavage. Yeah. Well, maybe I'll do that again. And next thing you know, you've got some money coming in. Yeah. And so there's a kind of a seduction that these girls are experiencing as they are engaged in seduction. Yeah. In other words, they're being pulled into this whole phenomenon. I'm not saying they're innocent. I'm just saying that there's it's a complicated mix.
That's right, and I think one of the things, to kind of jump ahead so we do get into it on the show, is that what we're dealing with is, of course, the image of God gone bad, right? In these cases, and the desire for something of that image to be retained and affirmed the right way, both publicly but also personally. And so, a couple of things going on here. One of the core things at the heart of being made in the image of God is the fact that we have a likeness to, and we're the image of God. We aren't selves that are self-constituted. We are selves only by our imitation of, if you will, in a creaturely way, of the very God whose image we're created in. But besides that, we are also imitative, and we have a desire for the mimetic built into our constitution. We have a desire to imitate and be imitated. And these are two key things, I think, that often get lost when we talk about being image bearers. Picking up a little bit on, I think the work of René Girard's famous mimetic desire, which was picking up on the image of God, basically. And he's really hitting heavy in his understanding of the human being and their relationships is grounded in this imitative behavior. And first and foremost, that we aren't, again, self-constituting selves. Our self, first and foremost, is relationally constituted, meaning we're always receiving it first from our Creator and always responding to it as gift from our Creator. So our self isn't something we possess in the way that Descartes thinks he did and moderns think they do, as some kind of isolated individual that can be a complete, genuine article. You receive yourself. Yeah. And you respond to that reception as gift at the fundamental level.
Yeah, and even at a psychological developmental level. When we think about children who have been raised in institutions where there are not the sort of given connections that are present in a healthy family, we see the unfortunate consequences of that with mental illness and but basically it's like you can create a lot of psychotics.
Yeah.
When you try to institutionalize child rearing, and what goes on in child rearing, of course, is imitative in the character. The child sees someone else, mimics what's been put on display, sees the other person see what that the child is doing. So I remember when my kids were small. I remember in particular my daughter. She was we were at a pool, and she would just look over at me to make sure I was watching.
Yeah.
No matter what it was, it could be the most unexceptional thing that a child can do. She wanted to know that I was watching her. Now, this is normal. This is key to healthy development.
Yeah.
But obviously there's a metaphysical, character to this as well. This is not just psychology. Psychology is a sort of a small, I guess you could say, reflection of a larger reality.
Yeah, it's one of the places that mimetic constitution we have shows up. I think you're right, and I think the psychological problems, especially the ones that have grown during the modernity and now dominate, I think grow out of the improper ordering of that imitation and the imitating the wrong things, or trying to be the one who is imitated without imitating anyone else. I think these things create all kinds of problems because first and foremost, we are relationally constituted. We aren't self-constituted. It's the attempt to self-sufficiency to mimic God who is self-sufficient, where we bit the fruit during the Enlightenment, have created all kinds of problems and created these imitation game problems. And I think this is where you end up in these kind of hilarious but sad, examples of it. I mean, Glenn just hit on a great one, Madonna. I mean, you think Madonna starts, she isn't the first, but she definitely was one of the most famous in my teenage years to start this kind of, her own kind of exhibitionism with song, I guess. And then that became a tradition. So the generation later, the Britney Spears, and now even I think the Taylor Swift, there's something in that line, even if they're not exactly the same. They are. It's all about that outfit and that kind of pop level music and the like. And there is one way in which you're not going to escape being able to be an artist, to be mimicking something somewhere. It's largely what musical arts and any other art is all about.
Yeah, related to Taylor Swift, I don't know a single guy who thinks she's all that attractive.
Yeah.
So she dresses up in these outfits, but who is her real audience? It's other chicks.
Yeah. Yeah.
Well, that's actually true of the entire cosmetics industry as well, but that's another matter. This isn't actually a new phenomenon. I mean, if you go back to the 16th century, the period that I study, you find things like, at the risk of citing Mel Brooks, you find men in tights. And part of the reason for that, particularly in England, is as Elizabeth got older, she liked to look at men's legs, and so But if you look at the portraits in the period, even going up to well into the 18th century, you'll see these guys standing there with knee breeches, and later on you've got knee breeches and high stockings, but they're standing in such a way that they're showing off their calf. Okay, you could think back to the Henry VIII's period, where guys would wear these big puffed shoulders on their clothes, and that's largely originated because Henry VIII actually had these big cannonball shoulders, and people wanted to imitate Henry, so they would pad their shoulders.
Another
in the immodest category, it was padding your cod pieces, but we won't get into that.
But getting to this is interesting. Who are we trying to impress? That's the thing. Who are we trying to impress? And often men are trying to impress other men, assuming that women will also be impressed. So it comes as kind of a shock to guys sometimes to note or to learn that Arnold Schwarzenegger is not viewed by many women as the ideal physical, the ideal physique. In fact, women often, in terms of what they're interested in, they're looking at something a lot slimmer, not something as quite as buff and over the top. So sometimes, when it comes to who you're trying to impress, you're kind of deceiving yourself. So this whole thing, there's just so many. There are wheels within wheels with regard to this, and levels of analysis that you can use.
Yeah, so you have women doing it for other women and men doing it for other men, and each of them completely miscommunicating with the other.
Yeah. Well, and then you get, of course, where where the communication breaks down, but not only that, where culturally they try to, blur all of that. You see this kind of internalization of imitating something one wants to be, even though one isn't endowed to be that way. You are seeing this, of course. I mean, well, let's take an extreme case: the people who now psychologically identify with pets, right? Cats. They're bringing litter box with them, and this is happening. This is, and
it's pretty sick. It's pretty sick.
Yeah, it is sick. But something. There's one thing where imitative creatures. That is true. But imitation is not to imitate everything. We imitate we're first and foremost, of course, to be images and imitators of God. But that is a mediated relationship too. It's done also through the ordering of mediations that are proper to our creatureliness, right? Family, society,
thinking about this ability that we have to imitate, there's a sense in which our souls reflect the world that they behold.
Yeah.
And then what you do with that can kind of go in all sorts of directions. I think great poetry, great fiction, what we see on display are people who have gifts that they possess to recreate or reproduce or to reflect the world they see around them, and then bring into the reflections that they have sort of new qualities or characteristics. There's also a synergism that happens, or a kind of synthesis that happens. This is something that Tolkien gets at in his famous essay on fairy stories. What subcreation is we work with the primary world to create a sub or secondary world in which things are brought together that in new and novel ways. And now there are limits to that. I mean, you can get into the phantasmagoria of that and the obscene, but you can also get into a beautiful and a pure and holy way of going about that. Like when I think about Tolkien, people have said when they finish reading Tolkien, they feel clean.
Yeah.
Here you have an imagination at work that is not. Well, it's obviously Tolkien was a human being and he was fallen like the rest of us, but there was something about his imagination that had been purified by the gospel.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, and I think that's where, these are tapping into dimensions of our being image bearers that are, they're very profound. The fact that we have imaginations, a lot of the theological tradition always, because of the abuses of the imagination, looked at it as just bad faculty, right? The nothing about it retrievable. Then you have examples, I think brilliant examples, not only of key theologians, but Christian contribution to the transformation of the arts and literature that just show what a sanctified mind can do when the imagination, because really to do any good theology, you have to be itself dealing with the transformation of your imagination. That's, as Glenn points out, the meaning, horizon in which all of our thinking works, and that isn't something that is one-to-one with our way of thinking. We're dealing already with the analogical, which is delving right into the imaginative, because we don't have a conception directly of what God is like, only analogically and revealed in, as Calvin would say, in a lisping of it to us. And so you can really see that, but this really connects with imitation can go in a healthy ways, and we are imitative by nature. And so one of the things I think that you see theologically is the warning of Scripture over and over and over again that you enact what you worship. You end up imitating what you worship. And when you get into Romans, when the ingratitude, when we start worshiping Satan, that's entering into the ingratitude. So we know we owe everything to God. But how we receive it, whether we're thankful or grateful, and what we do with that reception, whether we imitate God the right way or we refuse that and want to be our own God, we don't end up imitating or being original because we don't owe our existence to ourselves. So we become like the creature rather than creator. We begin to imitate the created world and in a broken way, so that we become enslaved to the more fundamental elements of the world rather than free the way we want to be. And I think with the Enlightenment, what you end up getting is Descartes, notice, he wants to be kind of like Anthony at this point, but even worse. He wants to develop a way that he can shut out all imitation. And he wants to doubt anything that has not been given to him but other than by himself, right? He wants to be self-constituting. He wants to be self-sufficient and self-constituting. He wants to univocally mimic the creator. That's what he wants. There's your idolatry, a self wanting to be like God without God, basically. Even though he talks a big game about believing in God, it's a projection of himself to ground it.
Yeah, I think that logically that's the case, Tom, but you really need one of the problems of Descartes is that we don't pay attention to what it was he was responding to.
Yeah.
And the key thing for him was Pyrrhonical skepticism, which is incredibly corrosive of any claim to certainty.
Yeah.
And so Descartes was actually trying to find a counter to Pyrrho, which is how it comes up with the cogito, the I think, therefore I am thing. And so, but the next step where he argues that he had to have gotten this concept of God from somewhere, he couldn't get it by analogy, therefore God himself must exist and must have given this to him. And then from there, he goes to the clear and distinct ideas thing. And once he has that, he's off to the races. I think, though, that it's a little bit unfair to Descartes to see him primarily through the lens of autonomous reason, because he was actually trying to respond to a genuine intellectual problem in the 17th century.
Well, let me push back a little bit on you, Glenn. One of the problems with historians is they focus on what was going on in the moment, and lose sight of of sort of the larger cultural sort of impact of something. So I have no doubt you're absolutely right that was what he was up to. At the same time, there is the law of unintended consequences.
Yeah, and I'll give you that. It's the only universal law of history. But what I'm getting at is what Descartes was trying to do, not what the effect was.
And in terms of his standing before the throne of judgment, you're probably right.
Yeah.
But in terms of his legacy, I'm not saying he's to blame for his legacy, but his legacy is more what Tom is saying.
Oh yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, and
philosophers don't know their history.
Well, the other part is I do know enough about him to know this part of history. He was not dealing with defense of classical view of God, even though he thought he was as a Catholic. He was defending nominalism in a very voluntarism. Even the whole problem of skepticism he's dealing with is what if you have a mad evil genius behind everything? You can't trust the reality behind things. So what can you stumble upon to become a ground of certainty that can even give you a certainty that there is some kind of God that isn't that evil, bad, mean genius or whatever going on behind the scenes? So he definitely has this. He's wrestling with the problem given to him by voluntarism and nominalism as it reached him.
And I will never argue that Descartes was orthodox.
Yeah.
Okay,
But it was his shutting himself into solitude and isolation in that oven that he went into that is very symbolic of what goes on when you're cutting out every kind of voice other than clear and distinct ideas that you're generating. You've entered into territory that is already suspicious of all mimetic knowing and forms of learning. Any mediated kinds of knowledge. Really, I mean, this is sort of what the legacy entailed.
Yeah, you're onto something here, Tom, that I've been thinking about a lot recently. So, when we lost sight of the transcendentals and the way that the creation mediates them to us, then creation becomes just stuff. We retreat into our consciousness. And what we become preoccupied with is how we impose values on the world at that point. So Descartes, to be sort of an early sort of transitional figure in that whole process. Now we are in a world where all of the mediation is the stuff that we create through technology. So, we're over mediated today.
Yeah.
Because we no longer believe that the creation itself says anything to us.
Yeah.
So even if you were to say, and this is, I've had this conversation with radical feminists and left-wing people. I say, that we're out of touch with reality. They don't even think that there's anything real out there to be in touch with.
Right.
Yeah. Yeah. That's right.
Yeah.
That's right.
Now, by the way, just my final comment on the 17th century, maybe.
Well, we're going to get to some others.
I would argue, what Descartes was trying to do was answer Pyrrho. Yeah. There were at least two other people who had more promising approaches in the 17th century, but they're largely forgotten, at least in terms of their impact on epistemology. One of them was a guy named Pierre Bayle, who argued for what I would describe as epistemological fideism. In other words, all knowledge is based on faith. And the one that actually was the wave of the future was Pascal, who argued that basically he said to Pyrrho, hey, you know what? You're right. We can't get certainty, but high levels of probability are good enough. And if we find out we're wrong, we'll change. Yeah. It's actually a movement called probabilism, and that's really foundational for what happens in as the scientific revolution moves forward, and it's foundational to the way we think today. So those were better responses to Pyrrho.
Yeah, and they have lost a participatory view of reality at this point. I mean, it's so obvious. They're trying to make up for how in the world the inside and the outside can be connected when they're now separated, and that's really where you end up. I mean, it's similar. You see that you still see that in philosophical epistemology, probabilism, and it's still floating around, very much so. But another thing you see, I think, that happens, with this trying to develop the self-constituting individual. However we got to it, we end up with it, and this can, I think you get a good example of another type of this with, of course, Rousseau. And I'll read a little bit from, ironically, that you have Rousseau, who is writing a book called Confessions. Of course, there's a connection to a tradition here, imitating, but taking a twist on Augustine. And was it Augustine? And who did Descartes do a Confessions as well?
I don't think remember. So.
I don't think so. But here is a quote. This is on. Let me make sure I have the right one. The one that Rousseau has. He goes, I have resolved on an enterprise which has no precedent. Okay, so he's the genuine article, right? And which, once complete, will have no imitator. There's your invitation to let's be like him, right? So my purpose is to display, notice the language, display, here's your attention grabbing, we need to be imitated, to my kind of portrait in every way true to nature. And the man I shall portray will be myself, right? So he has immediate connection to himself. He's not a mediated self. Simply myself, right? I know my own heart. The heart is desperately wicked, Rousseau, and understand my fellow man. But I am made unlike anyone I have ever met. I will even venture to say that I am like no one in the whole world. I may be no better, but at least I am different, right?
Yeah, well, I mean, Hume thought he was pretty different and thought he was nuts.
Yeah, but so did Voltaire.
That's right. But the audacity of what he stated and the contradictions that are implicit there are just when the way you frame this, it just this is absurd.
Well, the other person that I think he is imitating is actually Montaigne.
Yeah.
Because Montaigne's essays, Montaigne is the guy that we blame for the literary form, the essay. And the word essayer in French means to attempt. So what Montaigne was trying to get at with his essays was attempting to explore or define or elucidate what's going on in his own mind, his own thinking. It was an attempt toward an intellectual self-portrait.
Yeah, I think that people, if they're not familiar with Montaigne, really need to get acquainted with him. He was very seductive.
Another Pyrrhonist, by the way.
Yeah, when I read his essays, I could feel myself being seduced intellectually, and I was sort of drawn in it, but then I recoiled, and that's what Pascal is at. And I think he's. And when we think about what is the French intellectual's character, I think Montaigne is the progenitor of the French. So I think there were other people who were trying to move it in different directions. Pascal is an example of someone who was trying to move it somewhere else. Pascal was a guy that I would trust my child with. I wouldn't trust Montaigne with my dog.
Rousseau would leave your child off at the orphanage.
That's
right. Rousseau would try to kill them all.
So I don't know whether his obviously the very title Confessions shows that he's imitating Augustine.
Yeah.
And trying to do what Augustine did, which was an intellectual autobiography. But the way he described it, that passage you just read, really sort of rings Montaigne to me.
Yeah. Well, it's interesting. I was reading Charles Matthews' brilliant analysis of Augustine's first chapter of the Confessions, and says with Augustine, what you're getting is really anti-autobiography. The whole point is not to tell your own story, but to position you within relationship to God and your parents and the language, all the things that you imitate and you're immersed in. And what you get with figure like, you're right, exactly here, is you have someone giving their quote unquote autobiography.
Yeah, when we think about Anthony of the Desert, or Saint Anthony, or whatever you want to, whatever name you use to identify this guy, if we take him at his word, he was trying to do the exact opposite of Rousseau. He was trying to do the exact opposite of the modern approach. He was trying to just live for God. and that's it. And he was having a hard time doing it because he became famous without wanting to be.
And actually, if you look at the entire mystical tradition within Christianity, it's the same thing. Yeah. The mystical tradition is really focused on union with God, and in some of its more extreme versions, losing yourself in the process.
Yeah. Well, and I think, I think there's dangerous territory that eliminates aspects of our being full image bearers and the relational character. I mean, the point of the church and the like is not just, I understand there's a place for these things, but I'm in a calling at times, but I think that becoming the norm would have detrimental effects in a lot of ways.
We did a show on mysticism a few years ago, but what's interesting to me is you can actually identify the ones that I would describe as genuine mystics and the others that are mystic wannabes. Yeah. You compare Julian of Norwich, for example, with Marjorie Kemp, and you will see the difference instantly.
Julie, in the first case, there's somebody who became famous without wanting to be.
Yeah.
And then the second was, that's the way to become famous.
Well, that's it. And I think with Rousseau, you can see kind of, especially with a lot of these figures drawing this kind of attention to themselves the same way. But there is this sense in which there is a rebellion against our being imitative. This is what I mean by we are created to be imitative, both of God and the right kind of others, right? I mean, I think, listen to Paul. I mean, follow me as I follow Christ Jesus, right? You can be following Christ through following a saint, right? You don't worship a saint. You don't turn them into Christ. This is where things go wrong. But there is an imitative dimension through grace to be able to learn from others and their gifts And similarly with parents, learn what it means to grow up. Fathers, teach your children, right? I mean, there are all these things. What is teaching and cultivating? But here you have kind of an imitative desire to be free of imitation. That's what you kind of have. I remember when I first visited Oxford as a student, I went to a pub to try it out, and I ran into an arrogant undergrad who had, he was in his cup one too many. And he was trying to just show off his intelligence. And he said something to me, and I had given him a quote back. And he goes, "Well, you're just quoting other people. Why don't you try to have an original thought of your own?" And I said, "Well, you're just quoting." So he was completely stunned that his desire for not imitating anyone else was him imitating a whole tradition.
Yeah, I remember years ago I came across a statement that America is the non-tradition tradition.
Yeah.
And that just struck me.
Yeah.
I was like, okay, the pretense of being sort of sui generis, this idea that I'm uncreated, there's no precedent, is itself the product of a tradition.
Yeah.
And it just undermined all of the, and undermined a great deal of the sort of the popular American self-understanding.
That's it's interesting. I remember Stanley Hauerwas before his ethics class. He would start his ethics class on modernity. He'd say, "Modernity is the story that we have no story." Basically, we don't have a story. We're not traditioned. We're not immersed in a narrative about how things are and how things go. And that is itself has become the narrative. And it's a similar point. And I think this is what goes on here, though, is there is a problem at the heart of these Enlightenment projects and their traditions, America being one of them. And that is this notion of the human being trying to detach itself from its creatureliness and become like the creator in a univocal way, a one-to-one way, rather than analogously as a creature. And so when we do that, we start to basically want to take on the attributes of deity, self-sufficiency, right? There is a place for learning to be sufficient, but to be this kind of radical self-sufficient, the ground of my own being in more radical cases, or existentialism, the ground of my existence is through my self-constituting choices. But this notion of imitation is big because on the one hand, we think we don't want to imitate anyone. And by doing that, we're put in the delusion to think we're not, and we end up orienting ourselves towards bad things to imitate. And this is, I think, where I was going, heading from the start, is a lot of the immodesty and the influencers and the like that do the most damage are those that have a way of getting a foothold in those who also want to be original and liked the same way. They're envious and want to be liked the same way. So they start mimicking those things, all in their attempts to be genuine articles.
Yeah.
Go ahead, Glenn.
On another level, a related level, I'm thinking about Chris's comment about America. I wonder if this is also tied to the sort of radically egalitarian idea we have, anti-hierarchical and so on. It seems to me that is also an outgrowth of this, except, of course, you can't avoid hierarchy. Yeah. As soon as you start talking about influencers, for example, you are dealing with a kind of hierarchy.
Right. Yeah. I've been influenced by an influencer who is just totally original. And I want to be just like him or her. Totally original. Yeah. Getting to this, I think about there is a strange kind of upside to the kind of tradition of non-tradition. And the strange upside is there really is kind of a way in which, through a kind of self-deluded process, new things do come into the world, or new not in the sense of out of nothing, but unique, sort of synergistic creation. So, like when we think about what makes American culture so Protean, not Protean, but Promethean, in the sense that we're like the culture that creates things. Now, when we think about the Orient, when we think about Japan or China or whatever, obviously there are things about those cultures that are unique to those cultures and the gifts to the world that they bring. But when we think about who perfects the ideas, it's them. But who has the ideas? It's us. You just think about the various inventions that have come out of the West.
Yeah, it's a mixed bag too, because I think on the one hand you're exactly right. I mean, just things that you could never have conceived of. We've become capable of doing, and I think again a lot of that has been because of Glenn's talked about a lot the influence of Christianity on a kind of realism of creation that allows us to be able to relate to it and orient it in ways that do astounding things. I think on the flip side, because we do so much dismantling of a lot of that created hierarchy and those relationships, that we're just trying to figure out so much of the damage that we've done. I mean, you think of within a generation or two how quickly people influenced by the West have gotten to where they're not having kids. You think of these things and you think technologies are creative to basically coming in to fill the gap of that void in some way. So yes, we become innovative because we have to fill in something that should be there, and we're trying to replace it, and that we don't even know what that's going to do. It's really hard to measure, again, with all the gains, what flip sides have been, come along with it. And I think that's one area that's really worth thinking about, quite rigorously. And I think the other area is the fact that because we are so constituted by mimicking and imitating, there's a fragile side and a hopeful side. I mean, on the fragile side is, yes, there's a lot of bad things to imitate, and we can start imitating a lot of bad things if we're not, vigilant, and our children, of course. But it makes sense of why we educate and why we model, why discipleship is so key to the Christian life. And it isn't just about me putting information into your head, but it is about modeling and crafting, not just doing craftsmanship, but also crafting souls. And there is, I think, a deep relation. You talk about, a lot of the crafts. We've talked about Mike Crawford's work. I think there is a deep connection between our relationship to the creation itself and craftsmanship and soul crafting and right imitation. I mean, Jesus was a carpenter. I don't think that's arbitrary.
I think that's certainly important. But in my mind, I said before, I deal with words. That's what I do. When I look at somebody like Lewis or Tolkien, especially those two, but even poets, people like that, what they are doing is creating words out of worlds, worlds out of words, other way around, which it seems to me is the closest imitation to what God did in speaking the world into existence. That's why I appreciate craftsmanship certainly in any form. I've seen bricklayers who were artists, but there's something about that particular type of creation that strikes me as being closest to what you see God doing in creating a world that reveals the Creator's mind. Now, in a sense, you do that with art too, any art. But the verbal component for me, I think, is really important. That's just sort of my personal take on this.
Yeah. One of the things that I recall Lewis saying, and I can't tell you chapter and verse, but his point was, when you strive to be original, you are derivative without even knowing it. But when you strive to tell the truth, you're going to be original without intending to be. Yeah. And the reason is because your own personality is going to be added to to the mix. So what you bring to it is yourself.
Yeah.
And that's what's going to give it its original kind of quality.
Yeah.
But you're striving for truth.
Yeah. Well, one of the interesting things is this one of the kind of ironies of you find yourself in losing yourself is because you're imitative. And yeah, I mean, on this point, because we're imitative, we are such that our self is not constituted by isolation and being a self. It's constituted by pursuing the imitation of another, God first and others that we're in relation to. And it is as we, in a sense, lose ourself by this imitation that we truly exhibit our distinction. Think of just a crass version. I mean, Julian Lennon and Sean Lennon look like their dad, and they both sing, and they both try to sing like their dad. It's when they are trying to be and imitate their dad that you really see the difference between them, and you can kind of position which one you like more. But it's just like the more we become conformed to Christ, the more distinct we also become from Christ. And it's one of the ways in which that plays out. And I think, to your point, Glenn, I think holistically, is really where imitation takes place. I think you're right. There are dimensions to our imagination, our minds, being rational souls, being, words and the like, some that are much closer to being image bearers of God, where that image of God shows forth. But I definitely am honing in on the way in which a practice helps cultivate, just like we talk a lot about the crafting of souls. And just how that can provide like an image of the way in which discipleship is forming us the way we would form wood, in building something. But words, I think, are definitely a huge part of that.
Yeah, we should wrap things up here. We're at the point where this is when we do that. Anything you want to say in response there, Glenn?
No, I think I've probably said too much already.
Well, the last thing I want to get at is artificial intelligence and the images that it generates. Yeah. I don't know if you guys have observed this, but I can identify an AI-generated image kind of immediately. Yeah. And it doesn't have to do with the fact that some of the images have 6 fingers. It has to do with simply the fact that there's just not much originality to them. Yeah. There's a kind of it's almost like it can't figure out whether or not it is art or photography, for one thing. And then there's nothing that is generated that's truly kind of shaped by a personality. Like, think about Dr. Seuss. If you ask the machine to create an image that looks like Dr. Seuss, I suppose it would do its best and get something that could pass for Dr. Seuss. But AI is not Dr. Seuss. It's not Van Gogh. It's not Rembrandt. It's not any of those things. It can mimic those things, but it's not those things.
Yeah.
At this point, I want to jump in.
Sure.
John Lennox made a really interesting point about AI. He says, all right, you can convey information in a book on a printed page. You can convey the same information verbally. You can convey the same information on a computer screen. What that means is that information is independent of the physical substrate, as he puts it, that the medium through which it comes. What that means is that information is not actually physical, and therefore a computer cannot generate real information. And that connects in with art. It connects in with, whether these machines can really think, whether they can ever become self-aware, all of those kinds of things. Given the fact that thought is independent of the physical substrate, you can't get to thought from a physical thing, a physical object.
Right. Yeah, I think that's a great way to wrap this up here, Glenn.
Anyway, gives us another topic for another day.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. Thank you for listening to the Theology Pugcast. And we are not AI-generated images. We are actually human beings who are in different places right now. And you are where you are. And we're really pleased that you took the time to listen to this show and listen all the way to the end. And your reward for getting to the end is getting to hear me talk about Patreon. So the show, of course, costs some money to produce. We don't take any income from the show. Obviously, we benefit in other ways, but there are people who actually do need to make a living who produce our show. And the people who give through Patreon to the show on an ongoing basis help to pay the bills. So if you'd like to be one of those people who helps to pay the bills, there's a link in the show notes, and it'll take you to our Patreon page, and you can sign up. And if you did that, or if you do that, we will be happy and grateful. Anyway, that's enough for now. Thanks a lot, and bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
The Theology Pugcast is a ministry of Trinity Reformed Church in Huntsville, Alabama. To learn more about the church, you can visit trinityreformedkirk.com. trinityreformedkirk.com.